Hello, my name is Matt Harp. I'll be presenting on servant leadership. I hope to do something a little fun and interesting with this presentation. If you want to think ahead a little bit, I encourage you to take notes on some of the descriptions I put forward here. And later in the presentation, I'll ask you to consider a few of the agenda items from the description for this topic. As a reminder, those items were the characteristics of servant leaders, patterns of servant leadership, differences between transformational leadership and servant leadership, how to identify opportunities to implement servant leadership practices, and desired outcomes and future preparedness. The topic of this presentation is servant leadership. I'm Matt Harp, and I'm very honored to be part of the TechRochester Virtual Leadership Summit. Today we'll be covering the following topics. First, a quick introduction to myself, Matt Harp. Then I'll try to answer the following questions in a series of slides. First, what is servant leadership? Why practice servant leadership? Where should I use servant leadership patterns? Where would I avoid servant leadership patterns? How can servant leadership relate to other leadership models? What does servant leadership look like in practice? Why practice servant leadership in Rochester, New York? How can an individual practice servant leadership? And where can servant leadership take us? First, a quick introduction to myself. I'm Matt Harp. I'm a Rochester, New York native and a current resident of Rochester. I have more than 17 years experience founding and accelerating startups. I founded tech companies, consulting companies, and 2 schools. In each of the schools I founded, I developed and led a leadership academy. I have practiced enterprise architecture at both the University of Rochester and now currently at Paychex. Some of my recent efforts include I authored Rise, the Fundamental Patterns of Servant Leaders, which is a meditative book on patterns of strong servant leadership. And I founded Techner, which is a platform to refine ideas and accelerate innovation. Let's start by defining what is servant leadership. Well, leadership itself is not always the easiest term to define, and the definitions of leadership tend to be somewhat circular, and this will also be similarly a circular definition. So, servant leadership is one model of defining leadership, and it is based on the principle that leadership is service, and service is leadership. As a servant leader, your responsibility is to help your people. While management tends towards planning, leadership is service in a servant leadership model. Servant leadership focuses on the ability and resilience of the individual, and it is often defined through a set of 8 to 12 characteristic behaviors. Instead of going into depth into those characteristic behaviors, I offer up my own somewhat simplistic but relatively direct personal definition that servant leadership is the drive to refine and empower those around you. Where should I use servant leadership patterns? Well, servant leadership already mirrors many entrepreneurship practices. An entrepreneur or a startup makes themselves resilient while narrowing in on a vision. An entrepreneur must act as a servant leader. They're constantly motivating and being motivated by other individuals. Because a startup company is disruptive in its vision, it requires an individual who is highly resilient. I would also argue that large companies benefit from servant leadership patterns, and that companies with established but flexible or changing vision are great examples of companies that might benefit. The company that has an established vision but should be change tolerant, and a servant leader can serve the established vision while preparing individuals for any changes. Why practice servant leadership? Well, organizations benefit from personalized visions of success. Individuals who articulate their own value propositions and plans are valuable. Individual efforts should not be driven by ego, but by optimizing the benefit for all nearby. Another reason to practice servant leadership is for companies that are looking to transform themselves, either in part or completely. Innovation and disruption apply pressures to visions of company success, and when rapidly changing visions of company success emerge, this requires servant leaders. This can have a noticeable benefit during disruptive times, such as the COVID-19 quarantine we're currently experiencing. I would also argue that servant leadership is a great complement to common leadership models you might already find in large companies. One great example is the interaction of servant leadership with transformational leadership models. Where would I avoid servant leadership patterns? Servant leadership has a lower impact when a solid vision already exists. Servant leaders focus extensively on individuals. This pattern might not be the best suited model if individuals are already serving a meaningful vision. In those situations where a meaningful vision exists, servant leadership may not fully drive individuals towards that vision. It is wise to consider alternatives in situations where there are concrete and long-lasting visions. Focus on patterns of aligning individuals to a vision, and a suitable leadership model might be transformational leadership in those situations. I would argue that these two models, transformational leadership and servant leadership, should be considered complements. How can servant leadership relate to other leadership models? Well, I contrast servant leadership and also point out that it is compatible to transformational leadership models. Transformational leadership is based on the principle that leadership is transformation and transformation is leadership. Again, a somewhat circular definition. The adoption and pursuit of a higher ideal is a key component in both transformational leadership models and servant leadership models. The presence of multiple models is valuable and needed. I recommend that you use servant leadership models when individual abilities are mostly known, while a larger vision is actively developing or changing. I recommend using transformational leadership models when a larger vision is mostly known, while individual abilities are actively developing or changing. This ebb and flow between leadership model patterns mirrors a natural pattern of personal development. It creates a cycle of developing new visions and new abilities over time. What does servant leadership look like in practice? Servant leadership leans on and develops individual perspectives. The response of failure-tolerant individuals is a core mechanism to accelerate. When encountering a highly skilled group of people, aim to offer the following: large amounts of time dedicated to challenging and listening, very few directives or requirements, substantial time dedicated to surfacing concerns and roadblocks, and efforts to complete one small task or remove one small obstacle. When solving for a large problem, simultaneously solve for the current vision and prepare for change. The short-term need is part of this solution, but the solution must also prepare others for growth. How can an individual practice servant leadership? Expose, refine, and amplify ideas. Applying pressure to ideas forces the best ideas to the surface and eliminates weak concepts. One can also facilitate the collaboration and competition of ideas. This can be done by demonstrating the supply and demand for top ideas and top talent. Seek opportunities for growth through supporting innovation spaces. Look to refine and connect early ideas or innovative concepts. Finally, focus on practicing individual resilience and adaptability during uncertain times. Find individual stability as a method to promote adaptability. And keep on the path. TechRochester and all participants in this current series are practicing these patterns through these talks. Why practice servant leadership in Rochester, New York? One reason would be to create a presence of multiple leadership models in corporations and startups. Transformational leadership, which we discussed earlier, is a commonly implemented model. Servant leadership and the drive towards the individual are powerful in accelerating innovation. The boundaries of these two models are often areas of great creative collaboration, disruption, and innovation. As mentioned previously in the summit, Rochester ranked #1 for potential as a future tech hub in the book Jumpstarting America. In that book, Jonathan Gruber and Simon Johnson point to a high-impact combination of education and lifestyle factors in Rochester. Preparation for the potential as a future tech hub and a tech disruption requires resilient individuals and servant leaders. And finally, this pattern is extensible. The upstate New York region and Ohio offer similar action patterns. In the same book, Jumpstarting America, Rochester, Syracuse, Binghamton, Buffalo, and Albany are all in the top 16 targets. Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Akron, and Dayton are all in the top 20 targets. Highly educated former Rust Belt cities are a focus of high potential innovation growth targets. Where can servant leadership take us? Servant leadership creates an increased presence of vocal, visible, and failure-tolerant individuals. Servant leaders can provide a public forum or discussion where new concepts are refined. Such forums can act as a magnet for those who are willing to openly present innovative ideas. Servant leadership can also prepare us for change. Resilient individuals, those who are practicing servant leadership, allow for stability during organizational or cultural change. New definitive organizational visions allow for individual development. This mechanism of applying servant leadership can create a foundation for a resilient economic pattern. The stability of resilient individuals prepares for a new regional vision to emerge. That preparation readies individuals for the next wave of transformational leadership patterns.
Here comes the fun part, at least in my mind. At this point in the presentation, you might expect the delivery of a slide on next steps, including vision and action. I'd like to do something a little disruptive instead. I like discussions and projects that eat their own dog food. This phrase, or sometimes called dog fooding, points to the practice of using your own product. So I'll put a quick disruptive pause here instead of heading immediately into the vision and transformational slide. So far, we have all seen a good, if occasionally dry, definition of servant leadership. I'd like us to reflect back on this quickly. I'm going to articulate a vision at the end of the presentation, and I'd like us all to practice what it feels like to experience a pattern of servant leadership, especially as an ebb and flow interaction with transformational leadership.
We are back at the title slide, where I am again going to highlight several items from the agenda for this presentation. Those items on the agenda were the characteristics of servant leaders, patterns of servant leadership, differences between transformational leadership and servant leadership, how to identify opportunities to implement servant leadership practices, and desired outcomes and future preparedness. I'd also like to point out how I led the approach to those items. On the topics slide, I focused on posing these topics as a series of questions. This follows the guidance on what servant leadership looks like in practice. I'll skip down to the second major item and point out that when encountering a highly skilled group of people, such as this audience today, servant leaders offer large amounts of time dedicated to questioning and listening. While dedicated questioning and listening might come up in the Q&A section, I also look to frame the overall experience as an exercise in questioning. I also dedicate substantial time to surfacing concerns and roadblocks. I've offered very few directives or requirements, and I've attempted to complete one small task, in this case actually 5 small agenda tasks, and remove the obstacle of defining servant leadership. I'm going to return briefly to the first top-level call-out and point out that I am attempting to apply servant leadership practices by leaning on and developing your individual perspectives during this presentation. And to the third call-out on this page, when solving for a large problem, which this presentation begins to address, I both attempt to solve for the current vision and prepare for future change. The short-term needs of this presentation are part of the solution, but this solution must also prepare others, in this case, the audience, yourselves, for future growth. On the following slide, I look to point out how an individual can practice servant leadership. During the course of this presentation, I attempted to expose, refine, and amplify ideas. I'm hopeful that I've applied pressure to some ideas and might also receive some additional pressure from you all during a subsequent Q&A. In this situation, I'm looking to facilitate the collaboration and competition of ideas. I did this by demonstrating both supply and demand for top ideas, not so much top talent in this case, but also by comparing and contrasting two leadership models. I also seek opportunities for growth through supporting innovation spaces. This TechRochester Summit is itself an innovation space. In that space, I look to refine and connect early ideas or innovative concepts. To the final point on this slide, focus on practicing individual resilience and adaptability during uncertain times. In this situation, I am both practicing individual stability and encouraging you to find your own individual stability as a method to promote adaptability, and an encouragement to keep on the path to all TechRochester participants who are currently practicing these patterns through these talks. My pattern of leading through this presentation has to this point followed a servant leadership model. I'll quickly move through to get to the point where the next steps in the presentation are expected. Servant leadership as a component or precursor of transformational leadership and vision. Imagine a group which operated under this two-part leadership framework. A simple definition of leadership models and known transitions is a powerful force. Carry a simple definition with you. Examples include leadership is service and service is leadership, or leadership is transformation and transformation is leadership. Or the simple definition of servant leadership, that servant leadership is the drive to refine and empower those around you. Envision a world where servant leadership is commonly activated. Live so that each person considers assisting others through actions of empowerment. Act on situations where servant or transformational leadership is most needed. Lead the transformation of Rochester into a new model of emerging businesses. Pivot between leadership models. Find the spaces where leadership is needed. If done correctly, you and I should all have felt a tension or a transition. This pivot works only because you have experienced a condensed representation of servant leadership practices, and that this transition is exactly how a disruptive or innovative experience can be supported at scale. This type of transition moves resilient individuals with personal visions of profound empowerment to begin serving an enduring vision that is much larger than themselves. The more resilient the individual and the greater their need for vision, the more powerful a servant leadership practice will be.
I hope you enjoyed this. I tried to throw a fun presentation disruption idea in as well, showing the spaces where a presentation itself can model a pattern of servant leadership and a transition to transformational leadership. It probably only works during these times of virtual summits, but I thought that might be a fun reason to try something a little different. Thank you for joining me for this presentation. I hope this was helpful and an enjoyable experience for you, as it definitely was for me. Thanks.